Greetings, students. I hope you got a bit of a break. I know things are a bit strange and surreal at the moment, but I hope there was some reprieve in the last 2 weeks. We're going to dive straight back in and get back on with this course. This week we're going to look at the Brothers Grimm and folk tales. So this video will be a little introduction, and then I'll have a task or a job for you to do. And then the second video that comes will deal with your task for this week with instructions. So the Brothers Grimm are a pair of brothers that were born in the 18th century and lived into the 19th century in Hesse, which is in Kassel, Germany. And we're talking about Wilhelm 1786 to 1859 and Jakob 1785 to 1863. So we're jumping quite far ahead in time here. All of the stories all of the myths that we've done so far have been much earlier. These are much more recent. They were both philologists. What does that mean? Well, it's the study of languages or oral texts, and that was something that they did all their lives. So they were well placed to do what they did. Their childhood was under a foreign rule, Napoleon the First. So they had very patriotic feelings about the homeland and restoring Germanic roots, and that sort of comes out in a lot of the tales as well. They put out a volume called Children's and Household Stories in 1812, which went through various editions through 1857. And a lot of these stories that were compiled for this volume had to do with societal values and religious traditions, restoring morality and things like that. The folk stories are sort of updates, if you like, of previous versions. A lot of times they were taken from poetic epics of the Middle Ages and converted to prose form. They're sort of living artifacts. They include all kinds of things, these stories, as you can probably tell from the three that you read for class. Magic, horror, comedy, tall tales, exaggerated tales, collected mostly from women of the period. So they weren't written by the Grimms, they were compiled. They went out into their part of the world and sought out these stories and collected versions of them and put together volumes. For instance, there are 833 different tales in the collected tales that is in print today. Very much influenced by European Romanticism, the idea that the classic period, the style of stories from the Greeks and the Romans could be meshed with medieval Germanic and contemporary Christian traditions. That's why the stories have sort of an older feel, but there are a lot of contemporary elements as well. Of course, the great German Romantics of the period, the poets of the period, were the first of their kind. German Romanticism preceded Romanticism in England and America. Poets like Novalis, Goethe, and Schiller venerated folk tales and often used them in their poems. Fairy tale versus myth. We've gone through this, but I'll give you a quick reminder. Myths are, of course, stories of legendary and ancient gods and peoples. They're concerned with cosmogonic or origin stories, hero stories, and they were sort of rehearsed or spoken for the spiritual welfare of the community. They were shared, and they had a didactic purpose. They were supposed to illustrate lessons. Legends, of course, are historical stories rendered with mythological symbolism. Fables were usually written not really to be believed. They were fantastic stories involving often talking animals. But they were also to illustrate some sort of point or some sort of central wit to be passed on. Folk stories are slightly different. They're from the Märchen, which is German for folk or Volk. So they're the stories of common people They're not collected from high places. They're the stories of poor folk in the towns, in the rural areas, and they were tales told by the fireside or in groups, communal groups, for various purposes. They could include stories, proverbs, jokes, nursery rhymes, sung parts, and they were orally passed down until the Grimms and other compilers collected these stories and put them into print. Märchen just means little story. There's no distinction between folk or fairy stories, and a more direct or a more accurate translation is wonder tale, and I wish we kept that because it's a more accurate title for these stories. They really are wonder tales. They really don't have necessarily to do with fairies, although some of them do. There's a lot of drama in these stories, as you can tell from the 3 that we read for class today. Narrative, suspense, repetition, usually in 3s, and that's something that comes down from earlier times. You'll remember the Mesopotamian and the Bible stories often have repetitions of 3. The saying 3 times a charm comes from the idea that 3 is the perfect number, and it takes 3 times for humans to learn or cognate certain lessons. And there's always some sort of resolution, sometimes a marriage, sometimes an escape, but some sort of resolution can be good or bad. As I said, these were converted from earlier sources, ballads, which are verses of 4 lines that were often sung or stated in taverns, old epics or verse dramas, fables, things like that were the sources for a lot of these stories. They are syntactic rather than paratactic, so there is more of a sense of story, a connective word order, because they were shaped by these compilers like the Grimms and editors. And they often begin with once upon a time, or once there lived, or in a land far away. So there's sort of an effort to frame these stories in a way that we can understand them. Plot is everything in these stories. Characters are often flat, and setting is often scant. So there's not a whole lot of concentration on where the stories happen, or even some of the characters in the stories. They were kept simple because they were supposed to be for children and to be told in the household. Public storytelling wasn't new. Before the Grimms came along, the great printers Gutenberg and Caxton started printing books for common purchase, and the very first things that they published were Aesop's Fables, a group of short stories, and Chaucer's Tales, another group of short stories. They became vogue in the French salons, taught for what the French called civilité, or for moral and social correctness. But the Grimms heavily revised these stories and often made them more complex, always more violent. So they had psychological applications and were sort of gobbled up by the theorists of the day: Freud, Rank, Jung, James Fraser, the anthropologist, Joseph Campbell and Mircea Eliade, the mythographers. They believed that these stories shared behavioral traits. So Freud, for instance, concentrated on the system of family romance, the connections between parts of the family. Otto Rank centered on parental rejection in a lot of these stories. Jung centered on common archetypes, tales reflecting the unconscious that we all have or share. And it became vogue in the Victorian age to collect and classify everything by type and genus. Everything you can imagine, butterflies, mollusks, shells, were collected and classified, and stories are no different. So you would have folklorists, which was a new job type, if you like, that would go out, collect stories, create or construct monographs, which included various versions of stories or extant versions and variants, and then they catalogued them. And the Grimms were instrumental in making a science of this. They catalogued with the prefix KHM, which is Kinder- und Hausmärchen, which is children and home tales. And often, if they found fragments, they fused them together to make a complete tale. And if you read the third story today, Faithful John, you can kind of sense that it's been two different stories have been fused together there. Of course, there's a long history of short tales. We've dipped into it with The Golden Ass by Apuleius. Remember the animal groom tale that we read? There are episodes and poetic legends and epics from Homer to Beowulf to the prose Edda that deal with short stories. We're going to get into chivalrous romances, the Arthuriad, which are compilations of stories about the Arthurian legends, Crusader tales, the Chanson du Geste, which was a French story tradition, the Celtic stories, the Celtic underworld, compiled in a group called Tuatha De Danann, about the Irish myths, the stories of the Welsh bards told by people like Taliesin and the Mabingonian, which were the earliest folk prose tales in Britain. Not just European, though. There was the Panchatantra, which was a Hindu grouping of stories written in Sanskrit, which led to the Arabian Nights, compiled by a man named Galland. And then we have the great single author works I've mentioned: Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories, Boccaccio's Decameron, Hans Sachs' Meistersinger. These are all sort of groups of stories that have been heavily edited and compiled. And of course, as I said, the Grimms weren't the only people doing it. Charles Perrault collected French stories. Hans Christian Andersen, who you've heard of, collected Norse or Danish stories. And the composers of the period were doing the same thing. They were going out into the field, as it were, and collecting folk songs and putting them in their symphonies, composers like Dvorak and Bartok. So this was very much a thing that people did. There was a clamoring for folk sources. So as per the stories today, we looked at the Goose Girl, which seems to have its origins in Perchta, or Bertha, the goose-footed goddess. So that has an older source. And you can tell it's a type of story. It's like a coming-of-age, which the Germans will call a Bildungsroman, a rags to riches or a riches to rags story, like Beauty and the Beast and Snow White, a switching places story, a royal marriage of sorts, which we get in a lot of stories. Notice that the setting is fairly nondescript. There are some interesting places like the stream and the gate where the horse's head is hung, but it's fairly generic. The characters are all flat but perfunctory. They have a function: the absent father, the magical but ineffectual mother, ambitious and treacherous servant, the immature prince, the wise future father-in-law, the king, the greedy, mischievous boy named Conrad, and the careless princess undone by magic. Various symbols: the bloodied handkerchief with the 3 drops of blood seems to symbolize something. The talking horse, which is sort of a conscience figure. The golden hair, which is the princess's vanity or youth. The wind, the power that she seems to have. The iron stove at the end, which is sort of like a womb-like implement. The nailed barrel, which is the final justice in the story. But there are logical elements as well. Tales are often monstrous and irrational. The cloth with the 3 drops of blood doesn't really do anything, does it? It doesn't really provide anything to the princess. Falada, the talking animal, seems somewhat inadequate. She has control over the wind. She has magic power over the wind, but not over her servant, which seems a bit odd as well. So I'm going to end this first video here because I've ran out of time. So just go ahead and sign in the comments to indicate your presence, and then proceed to listen to the next video, which will talk about the second story and your assignment or task for this week. Okay, see you there.